Hi everybody, this is Julie Bean with Beadaholique, and in this video I want to talk to you about how to choose the right gauge of wire head pins or eye pins for your jewelry projects. So you're given a lot of choices. If you want to make a design and you go over to beadaholique.com, you'll see that you can have all different finishes of head pins and eye pins, but also all different gauges. And the gauge simply is how thick it is. So the larger the number, like a 24 gauge wire head pin, is thinner than a 20 gauge. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but think of it as the larger the number, the thinner it is. So in front of me here, I have three different wire head pins. I have a silver plated one, which is 24 gauge. And if you look at this, it is quite thin and it's actually quite flexible too. Next to it, I have a 22 gauge. So this one gets a little bit thicker and it's definitely a little bit stiffer. And then I have a 20 gauge, and this one is quite stiff, and you can see how much thicker it is. So let me see if I can put them together, and then you can maybe see them. So you can, even on camera here, see that there is a difference in the thickness of these. And so what you're gonna wanna consider is its usage. So if you are designing a project, you wanna think, well, what am I going to be using it for? So I have a pair of earrings right here that I just made, and I used the little 24 gauge head pins. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, this is a very delicate little design, and I wanted it to easily slip through those links of the chain. This is a 2mm Rolo chain, so I wanted to slip through. Now I also knew I wanted to do wrapped wire loops, and it is much easier to do wrapped wire loops with a thinner gauge wire. So if you're gonna be doing wrapped wire loops, I would suggest a 24 gauge wire. So that is going to be very easy to do. It's not going to be hard on your fingers, and it's going to be quite easy to do in quantity. So let's say you're making jewelry to sell, or you're doing a piece with a bunch of them. If you have a really thick wire, it can start to kind of hurt your fingers a little bit if you're having to constantly do it. So I really like 24 gauge for my wrapped wire loops. I also will sometimes do the 22 gauge as well. So 22 gauge also works well for wraps. When I start to get into the 20 gauge, I don't do wraps as much, but that's also because this wire is really strong enough that it's not gonna pull out. So that's another consideration. You have to think, what are you doing with your piece of jewelry that you want it to be structurally sound? So I have an example here. Here's a little earring I did, and I made a little link using an eye pin. Now I did use a 22 gauge eye pin for this one. That is as thin as I want to go. So I can tug on this and my loops are not going to pull out. If I was to tug on this and this was a 24 gauge, they would start to separate. So you want to think about that too. If you're going to be doing something that's a connector piece, or you're just going to be doing a simple wire loop, I would keep it to 22 gauge and thicker. So 22, 21, 20 if you're going to be doing simple wire loops, which is what you see here. So you see there's no wrapping. So when I say a simple wire loop versus a wrapped wire loop, it is basically both are loops, but on one of them, we've actually wrapped the wire around itself several times to secure it. This is not coming undone. We also cannot open it up or close it like a jump ring. On this one, if we wanted to, we could just open up that loop, and like we did here, we slipped on the chain. So they make really great connectors. So if you're doing simple wire loops, 22 gauge is as thin as I would recommend going, and then you could do 21, you could do 20 as well. And then if you're doing wrapped wire loops, I really like 24 gauge or 22 gauge. Now there are some cases where I do a little bit thicker. This is a 20 gauge, and I did this because I really wanted this to be sandwiched tightly for my design. So I've got that little bead cap by Nun Design. I'm actually using a little jump ring as a spacer, and I wanted this to be very like securely squashed together. And so by doing the wraps, it tightened everything up. If that had been a simple wire loop, there would have been more wiggle room, and I just did not want any wiggle room on this. So I'm going to show you real quick the difference between doing a wrapped wire loop with a 24 gauge wire versus doing it with a 20 gauge. So it's going to be the same process, but I'm going to show you how relatively easy it is to do with the thinner wire. All right, so I've got my wire looping pliers, which I love. I'm just going to cross it over crisscross my wire. Okay, so I've got that loop. If you were doing a simple wire loop, you would just stop right there and trim your tails where they crisscross, or your wire where it crisscrosses, but we're gonna be doing a wrapped wire loop. So this again is the 24 gauge wire, and all I have to do is I take my fingers and I just wrap it. And it's very easy, very, very easy to wrap. And then I trim it off and I tuck my tail. Okay, so that was 24 gauge. Let me show you with the 20 gauge. Same little bead. So I've got that on there. Now I'm going to do this with my wire looping pliers. And it's harder to push down because the wire is so much thicker. And I'd have to pull it. I actually had to give that a pretty good yank. Now I'm going to wrap it, but it's a lot stiffer. And I actually have to really work at it to make those wraps. It is doable. It does give you a little bit of a heavier look, which is an aesthetic choice that you might want to make. But it is a lot, you see my finger here, it is a lot harder to wrap it. And then same process, you would tuck your tail. So there are instances where you are going to want to use the thicker gauge wire, even for wrapped wire loops. But I would recommend, if you're going to be doing a bunch of them or you want your design to be delicate, use the thinner gauge. So I hope that overview helped a little bit. So if you are doing a link or a connector piece or a simple wire loop, try to keep it to the 20, 21, 22 gauges. If you are doing a wrapped wire loop, I do recommend the 22 gauge or the 24 gauge. So that was a quick overview. If you would like more tips on jewelry design and more projects and inspiration, please do head over to beadaholique.com. We've got hundreds and hundreds of videos and projects and fun things to help you learn how to make jewelry.